So, how you gonna get me down from here, cop? Do you think I'll let you cuff me and then just lay up here while you go for backup? No way, pig face. Listen and believe me, I'll blow you away without the slightest hesitation. Yeah? Well, I'll take that gun off you quicker than you think. Then I'll rip your head off and shove it up your ass. With unconcealed distaste, Frank said, Is it really necessary to be so vulgar? Grinning more broadly, Skagg moved toward him. Frank shot him point blank in the chest. The hard report echoed off the metal walls, and Skagg was thrown backward. Screaming, he pitched off the crates and plummeted into the aisle below. He landed with a thunk that cut off his scream. Skagg's violent departure caused the crates to rock, and for a moment the unmortared wall of boxes swayed dangerously, creaking and grinding. Frank fell to his hands and knees. Waiting for the stacks to steady under him, he thought about all the paperwork involved in his shooting, the many forms required to appease the bleeding hearts, who were always certain that every victim of police gunfire was as innocent as Mother Teresa. He wished that Skagg had not forced the issue so soon. He wished that the killer had been more clever, had managed a more involved game of cat and mouse before the climactic scene. Thus far, the chase had not provided half enough fun to compensate for the mountain of paperwork ahead. The crates quickly steadied, and Frank got to his feet. He moved to the edge of the wall, to the place where Skagg had been flung into empty space by the impact of the slug. He looked down into the aisle. The concrete floor was silvery in the glow of the security lamp. Skagg was not there. Stormlight flickered at the windows in the warehouse eaves. At his side, Frank's shadow leaped, shrank back, leaped and shrank again as though it belonged to Alice in one of her potion-swilling fits beyond the looking-glass. Thunder pummeled the night sky, and an even harder fall of rain dissolved against the roof. Frank shook his head, squinted into the aisle below, and blinked in disbelief. Skagg was still not there. 3. Having descended the crates with caution, Frank Shaw looked left and right along the deserted aisle. He studied the shadows intently, then crouched beside the spots and smears of blood where Carl Skagg had hit the floor. At least a liter of blood marked the point of impact, so fresh that a portion had still not soaked into the porous concrete but glistened in small, red, shallow puddles. No man could take a .38 hollow point in the chest at point-blank range, get up immediately, and walk away. No man could fall 3 stories under concrete and spring straight to his feet. Yet that seemed to be what Skagg had done. A trail of gore indicated the man's route. With his .38 tightly in hand, Frank traced the cycle to an intersection, turned left into a new aisle, and moved stealthily through alternating pools of shadow and light for 150 feet. There, he came to the end of the blood trail, which simply stopped in the middle of the passage. Frank peered up at the piled crates on both sides, but Skagg was not clinging to either partition. No offshoot passageways between the boxes, and no convenient niches provided a good hiding place. Although badly hurt and hurrying to get out of his pursuer's reach, Skagg appeared to have carefully bound his grievous wounds to control the bleeding, had literally bound them on the run. But with what? Had he torn his shirt into strips to make tourniquets? Bandages? Damn it! Skagg had a mortal chest wound. Frank had seen the terrible impact of bullet in flesh, had seen Skagg hurled backward, had seen blood. The man's breastbone was shattered, splinters driven inward through vital organs, arteries and veins were severed. The slug itself surely passed through Skaggs' heart. Neither tourniquets nor bandages could staunch that flow or induce mangled cardiac muscles to resume rhythmic contractions. Frank listened to the night. Rain, wind, thunder, otherwise silence. Dead men don't bleed, Frank thought. Maybe that was why the blood trail ended where it did, because Skaggs died after going that far. But if he had died, death had not stopped him. He had kept right on going. And now what am I chasing? A dead man who won't give up? Most cops would have laughed off such a thought, embarrassed by it. Not Frank. Being tough, hard, and unbreakable did not mean that he had to be inflexible as well. He had the utmost respect for the mysterious complexity of the universe. A walking dead man. Unlikely. But if that was the case, then the situation was certainly interesting. Fascinating. Suddenly, Frank was more thoroughly involved in his work than he had been in weeks. 4. The warehouse was vast, but, of course, finite. As Frank explored the gloom-filled place, however, the chilly interior seemed to be larger than the space enclosed by its walls, as if portions of the building extended into another dimension, or as if the actual size of the structure changed magically and constantly to conform to his exaggerated perception of its immensity. He searched for Skaggs in aisles formed by crates, and along other aisles between towering metal shelves filled with cardboard cartons. He stopped repeatedly to test the lids of crates, suspecting that Skaggs had hidden in an empty one, but he found no makeshift coffin belonging to the walking dead man. Twice he briefly suspended the search to take time to stay in touch with the throbbing pain in his side. Intrigued by the mystery of Skaggs' disappearance, he had forgotten that he'd been hammered with a length of steel rebar. His extraordinary ability to block pain contributed to his hard-boiled reputation. A good buddy in the department once said that Hardshell Shaw's pain threshold was between that of a rhinoceros and a wooden fence post. But there were times when experiencing pain to the fullest was desirable. For one thing, pain sharpened his senses and kept him alert. Pain was humbling as well. It encouraged a man to keep his perspective, helped him to remember that life was precious. He was no masochist, but he knew that pain was a vital part of the human condition. 15 minutes after having shot Skaggs, Frank still hadn't found him. Nevertheless, he remained convinced that the killer was in the warehouse, dead or alive, and had not fled into the rainy night. His conviction was based on more than a hunch. He possessed the reliable intuition that distinguished great cops from good cops. A moment later, when his intuition proved unnervingly accurate, Frank was exploring a corner of the building where 20 forklifts of various sizes were parked beside a dozen electric carts. Because of their knobby hydraulic joints and blunt tines, the lifts resembled enormous insects, and in the smoky yellow glow of the overhead lamp they cast praying mantis silhouettes across other machinery. Frank was moving quietly through those spiky shadows when Carl Skaggs spoke behind him. "You looking for me?" Frank turned, bringing up his gun. Skaggs was about 12 feet away. "See me?" the killer asked. His chest was intact, unwounded. "See me?" His 3-story fall had resulted in no shattered bones, no crushed flesh. His blue cotton shirt was stained with blood, but the source of those stains was not visible. "See me?" "I see you," Frank said. Skaggs grinned. "You know what you're seeing? A piece of shit. Can your small mind possibly conceive of my true nature? Sure, you're a dog turd. You can't offend me," Skaggs said. "I can try. Your petty opinions are of no interest or concern to me. God forbid that I should bore you. You're getting tiresome, and you're nuts." Skaggs cracked the humorless smile of the sort that earlier had reminded Frank of a crocodile's grin. "I'm so far superior to you and to all of your kind that you're incapable of judging me." "Oh, then forgive me for my presumption, great Lord." Skaggs' grin faded into a vicious grimace, and his eyes widened. They no longer seemed like ordinary brown eyes. In their dark depths was a hungry, chilling, reptilian watchfulness that made Frank feel as if he were but a field mouse, staring into the mesmeric eyes of a black snake. Skaggs took one step forward. Frank took one step backward. "Your kind only have one use. You're interesting prey." Frank said, "Well, I'm glad to hear we're interesting." Skaggs took another step forward, and a mantis shadow rippled across his face. Frank stepped backward. "Your kind are born to die." Always interested in the workings of a criminally insane mind, just as a surgeon is always interested in the nature of the cancers that he excises from his patients' bodies, Frank said, "My kind, huh? What kind is that, exactly?" "Humankind." "Ah, humankind," Skaggs repeated, speaking the word as if it were the vilest epithet. "You're not human, is that it?" "That's it," Skaggs agreed. "What are you, then?" Skaggs' insane laughter was as affecting as hard Arctic wind. Feeling as if bits of ice had begun to form in his bloodstream, Frank shivered. "All right, enough of this. Drop to your knees, then flat on your face." "You're so slow-witted," Skaggs said. "Now you're boring me. Lie down and spread your arms and legs, you son of a bitch." Skaggs reached out with his right hand in such a way that for one disconcerting moment it seemed to Frank that the killer was going to change tactics and begin pleading for his life. Then the hand began to change. The palm grew longer, broader. The fingers lengthened by 2 inches. The knuckles became thicker, gnarled. The hand darkened until it was singularly unhealthy, mottled brown, black, yellow. Coarse hairs sprouted from the skin. The fingernails extended into wickedly sharp claws. "So tough you were. Imitation Clint Eastwood. But you're afraid now, aren't you, little man? Afraid at last, aren't you?" Only the hand changed. No alterations occurred in Skaggs' face or body, or even in his other hand. He obviously had complete control of his metamorphosis. werewolf," Frank said in astonishment. With another peal of lunatic laughter that rebounded tinnily from the warehouse walls, Skagg worked his new hand, curling and extending and recurling his monstrous fingers. "No, not a werewolf," he whispered fiercely. "Something far more adaptable, something infinitely stranger and more interesting. Are you afraid now? Have you wet your pants yet, you chicken-shit cop?" Skagg's hand began to change again. Coarse hairs receded into the flesh that had sprouted them. The mottled skin grew darker still, the many colors blending into green-black, and scales appeared. The fingertips thickened and grew broader, and suction pads formed on them. Webs spun into existence between fingers. The claws subtly changed shape, but they were no shorter or less sharp than the lupine claws had been. Skagg peered at Frank through those hideous spread fingers and over the half-moon curves of the opaque webs. Then he lowered his hand slightly and grinned. His mouth had also changed. His lips were thin, black, and pebbled. He revealed pointed teeth and two hooked fangs. A thin, glistening, fork-tipped tongue flickered across those teeth, licked the pebbled lips. At the sight of Frank's horrified astonishment, Skagg laughed. His mouth once more assumed the appearance of a human mouth. But the hand underwent yet another metamorphosis. The scales were transformed into a hard-looking, smooth, purple-black, chitinous substance, and the fingers, as if wax brought before a flame, melted together until Skagg's wrist terminated in a serrated, razor-sharp pincer. "You see? No need of a knife for this night slasher," whispered Skagg. "Within my hands are an infinite variety of blades." Frank kept his .38 revolver pointed at his adversary, though by now he knew that even a .357 Magnum, loaded with Magnum cartridges with Teflon tips, would provide him with no protection. Outside, the sky was split by an axe of lightning. The flash of the electric blade sliced through the narrow windows high above the warehouse floor. A flurry of rafter shadows fell upon Frank and Skagg. As thunder crashed across the night, Frank said, "What the hell are you?" Skagg did not answer right away. He stared at Frank for a long moment and seemed perplexed. When he spoke, his voice had a double-honed edge, curiosity and anger. "Your species is soft. Your kind has no nerve, no guts. Faced with the unknown, your kind react as sheep react to the scent of a wolf. I despise your weakling breed. The strongest men break after what I've revealed. They scream like children, flee in panic, or stand paralyzed and speechless with fear. But not you. What makes you different? What makes you so brave? Are you simply thick-headed? Don't you realize you're a dead man? Are you foolish enough to think you'll get out of this place alive? Look at you. Your gun hand isn't even trembling." "I've had more frightening experiences than this," Frank said tightly. "I've been through 2 tax audits." Skagg did not laugh. He clearly needed a terrified reaction from an intended victim. Murder was not sufficiently satisfying. Evidently, he also required the complete humiliation and debasement of his prey. "Well, you bastard, you're not gonna get what you need from me," Frank thought. He repeated, "What the hell are you?" Clacking the halves of his deadly pincers, slowly taking a step forward, Carl Skaggs said, "Maybe I'm the spawn of hell. Do you think that could be the explanation?" "Stay back," Frank warned. Skaggs took another step toward him. "Am I a demon, perhaps, risen from some sulphurous pit? Do you feel a certain coldness in your soul? Do you sense the nearness of something satanic?" Frank bumped against one of the forklifts, stepped around the obstruction, and continued to retreat. Advancing, Skaggs said, "Or am I something from another world? A creature alien to this one, conceived under a different moon, born under another sun?" As he spoke, his right eye receded into his skull, dwindled, vanished. The socket closed up as the surface of a pond would close around the hole made by a pebble. Only smooth skin lay where the eye had been. "Alien? Is that something of which you could conceive?" Skaggs pressed. "Have you sufficient wit to accept that I came to this world across an immense sea of space, carried on galactic tides?" Frank no longer wondered how Skaggs had battered open the door of the warehouse. He would have made horn-like hammers of his hands, or iron-like pry bars. No doubt he had also slipped incredibly thin extensions of his fingertips into the alarm switch, deactivating it. The skin of Skaggs' left cheek dimpled, and a hole formed in it. The lost right eye flowered into existence within the hole, directly under his left eye. In 2 winks, both eyes reformed. They were no longer human, but insectoid, bulging and multifaceted. As if changes were taking place in his throat, too, Skaggs' voice lowered and became gravelly. "Demon. Alien. Or maybe I'm the result of some genetic experiment gone terribly wrong. What do you think?" That laugh again. Frank hated that laugh. "What do you think?" Skaggs insisted as he approached. Retreating, Frank said, "You're probably none of those things. Like you said, you're a stranger, and more interesting than that." Both of Skaggs' hands had become pincers now. The metamorphosis continued up his muscular arms as his human form gave way to a more crustacean anatomy. The seams of his shirt sleeves split. Then the shoulder seams also tore as the transformation continued into his upper body. Chitinous secretions altered the size and shape of his chest, and his shirt buttons popped loose. Though Frank knew he was wasting ammunition, he fired 3 shots as rapidly as he could squeeze the trigger. 1 round took Skaggs in the stomach, 1 in the chest, 1 in the throat. Flesh tore, bones cracked, blood flew. The shape-changer staggered backward, but did not go down. Frank saw the bullet holes and knew that a man would die instantly of those wounds. Skaggs merely swayed. Even as he regained his balance, his flesh began to knit up again. In half a minute, the wounds had vanished. With a wet, cracking noise, Skaggs' skull swelled to twice its previous size. Though the change had nothing to do with the revolver fire that the shape-changer had absorbed, his face seemed to implode, all the features collapsing inward, but almost at once a mass of tissue bulged outward, and began to form queer insectoid features. Frank did not wait to see the grotesque details of Skag's new countenance. He fired 2 more rounds at the alarmingly plastic face, then ran, leaped over an electric cart, dodged around a big forklift, sprinted into an aisle between tall metal shelves, and tried not to feel pain in his side as he ran back through the long warehouse. When that morning had begun, dreary and rain-swept, with traffic moving through the city's puddled streets at a crawl, with the palm trees dripping, with the buildings somber in the gray storm light, Frank had thought that the spirit of the day was going to be as soggy and grim as the weather, uneventful, boring, perhaps even depressing. Surprise! Instead, the day had turned out to be exciting, interesting, even exhilarating. He just never knew what fate had in store for him next, which was what made life fun and worth living. Frank's friends said that in spite of his hard shell, he had an appetite for life and fun. But that was only part of what they said about him. Skag let out a bleat of rage that sounded utterly inhuman. In whatever shape he had settled upon, he was coming after Frank, and he was coming fast. 5. Frank climbed swiftly and unhesitatingly in spite of the pain in his ribs. He heaved himself onto the top of another 3-story-high wall of crates, machine tools, transmission gears, ball bearings, and rose to his feet. 6 other crates, which were not part of the wall itself, were stacked at random points along the otherwise flat top of those wooden palisades. He pushed one box to the edge. According to the printing on the side, it was filled with 24 portable compact disc players, the kind that was carried by antisocial young men who used the volume of their favorite unlistenable music as a weapon with which to assault innocent passers-by on the street. He had no idea what the damn things were doing among the stacks of machine tools and bearings, but the box weighed only about 200 pounds, and he was able to slide it. In the aisle below, something issued a shrill, piercing cry that was part rage, part challenge. Frank leaned out past the box that he had brought to the brink, squinted down, and saw that Carl Skag had now assumed a repulsive insectoid form that was not quite that of a 250-pound cockroach, and not quite a praying mantis, but something between. Suddenly, the thing's chitin-capped head swiveled, its antennae quivered, multifaceted, luminous amber eyes gazed up at Frank. He shoved the box over the edge. Unbalanced, he nearly plummeted with it. Wrenching himself back from the brink, he tottered and fell on his butt. The carton of portable compact disc players met the floor with thunderous impact. 24 arrogant punks with bad taste in music, but with a strong desire for high-tech fidelity, would be disappointed this Christmas. Frank crawled quickly to the edge on his hands and knees, looked down, and saw Skag's squirming insectoid form struggling free of the burst carton that had briefly pinned him to the floor. Getting to his feet, Frank began to shift his weight rapidly, back and forth, rocking the heavy crate under him. Soon half the wall was rocking too, and the column of boxes beneath Frank swayed dangerously. He put more effort into his frantic dance of destruction, then jumped off the toppling column just as it began to tilt out of the wall. He landed on an adjacent crate that was also wobbling but more stable, and he fell to his hands and knees. Several formidable splinters gouged deep into his palms, but at the same time he heard at least half a dozen heavy crates crashing into the aisle behind him, so his cry was one of triumph rather than pain. He turned and flat on his belly this time, eased to the brink. On the floor below, Skagg could not be seen beneath the ton of debris. However, the shape-changer was not dead. His inhuman screams of rage attested to his survival. The wreckage was moving as Skagg pushed and clawed his way out of it. Satisfied that he had at least gained more time, Frank got up, ran the length of the wall of boxes, and descended at the end. He hurried into another part of the warehouse. Along his randomly chosen route, he passed the half-broken door by which he and Skagg had entered the building. Skagg had closed it and stacked several apparently heavy crates against it to prevent Frank from making an easy, silent exit. No doubt the shape-changer also had damaged the controls for the electric garage doors at the front of the warehouse and had taken measures to block other exits. You needn't have bothered, Frank thought. He was not going to cut and run. As a police officer, he was duty-bound to deal with Carl Skagg, for Skagg was an extreme threat to the peace and safety of the community. Frank believed strongly in duty and responsibility, and he was an ex-Marine. And, well, though he would never have admitted as much, he enjoyed being called Hardshell, and he took pleasure in the reputation that went with the nickname. He would never fail to live up to that reputation. Besides, though he was beginning to tire of the game, he was still having fun. 6. Iron steps along the south wall led up to a high balcony with a metal grid floor. Off the balcony were 4 offices in which the warehouse's managerial, secretarial, and clerical staffs worked. Large sliding glass doors connected each office with the balcony, and through the doors Frank could see the darkish forms of desks, chairs, and business equipment. No lamps were on in any of the rooms, but each had outside windows that admitted the yellow glow of nearby street lamps and the occasional flash of lightning. The sound of rain was loud, for the curved ceiling was only 10 feet above. When thunder rolled through the night, it reverberated in that corrugated metal. At the midpoint of the balcony, Frank stood at the iron railing and looked across the immense storage room below. He could see into some aisles, but by no means into all, or even a majority. He saw the shadowy ranks of forklifts and electric carts, among which he had encountered Skagg, and where he had first discovered his adversary's tremendous recuperative powers and talent for changing shape. He also could see part of the collapsed wall of crates where he had buried Skagg under machine tools, transmission gears, and CD players. Nothing moved. He drew his revolver and reloaded. Even if he fired 6 rounds point-blank into Skagg's chest, he would succeed only in delaying the shape-changer's attack for a minute or less while the bastard healed. A minute, just about long enough to reload. He had more cartridges, although not an endless supply. The gun was useless, but he intended to play the game as long as possible, and the gun was definitely part of the game. He no longer allowed himself to feel the pain in his side. The showdown was approaching, and he could not afford the luxury of pain. He had to live up to his reputation and become Hardshell Shaw, had to blank out everything that might distract him from dealing with Skagg. He scanned the warehouse again. Nothing moved, but all the shadows in the enormous room, wall to wall, seemed to shimmer darkly with pent-up energy, as if they were alive and, though unmoving now, were prepared to spring at him if he turned his back on them. Lightning cast its nervous, dazzling reflection into the office behind Frank, and a bright reflection of the reflection flickered through the sliding glass doors onto the balcony. He realized that he was revealed by the sputtering third-hand electric glow, but he did not move away from the railing to a less conspicuous position. He was not trying to hide from Carl Skagg. After all, the warehouse was their Samara, and their appointment was drawing near. However, Frank thought confidently, Skagg is sure going to be surprised to discover that the role of death in this Samara belongs not to him, but to me. Again lightning flashed, its image entering the warehouse not only by way of the offices behind Frank, but through the narrow panes high in the eaves. Ghostly flurries of stormlight fluttered across the curve of the metal ceiling, which was usually dark above the shaded security lamps. In those pulses of queer luminosity, Skagg was disclosed at the highest point of the ceiling, creeping along upside down, as if he were a spider with no need to be concerned about the law of gravity. Although Skagg was visible only briefly, and not in much detail, he currently seemed to have cloaked himself in a form that was actually less like a spider than like a lizard. Holding his .38 in both hands, Frank waited for the storm's next bright performance. During the dark intermission between acts, he estimated the distance Skagg would have traveled, slowly tracking the unseen enemy with his revolver. When again the eave windows glowed like lamps and the spectral light glimmered across the ceiling, his gun sights were aimed straight at the shape-changer. He fired 3 times and was certain that at least 2 rounds hit the target. Jolted by the shots, Skagg shrieked, lost his grip, and fell off the ceiling. But he did not drop stone swift to the warehouse floor. Instead, healing and undergoing metamorphosis even as he fell, he relinquished his spider-lizard form, reverted to his human shape, but sprouted bat-like wings that carried him, with a cold, leathery flapping sound, through the air, across the railing, and onto the metal grid balcony only 20 feet from Frank. His clothes, even his shoes, having split at the seams during one change or another, had fallen away from him, and he was naked. Now the wings transformed into arms, one of which Skagg raised to point at Frank. "You can't escape me." I know, Frank said. "You're like a cocktail party boar, descended from a leech." The fingers of Skagg's right hand abruptly telescoped out to a length of 10 inches, and hardened from flesh into solid bone. They tapered into knife-like points with edges as sharp as razor blades. At the base of each murderous fingertip was a barbed spur, the better to rip and tear. Frank squeezed off the last 3 shots in the revolver. Hit, Carl Skagg stumbled and fell backward on the balcony floor. Frank reloaded. Even as he snapped shut the cylinder, he saw that Skagg already had risen. With an ugly burst of maniacal laughter, Carl Skagg came forward. Both hands now terminated in long, bony, barbed claws. Apparently, for the sheer pleasure of frightening his prey, Skagg exhibited the startling control he possessed over the form and function of his flesh. 5 eyes opened at random points on his chest, and all fixed unblinking on Frank. A gaping mouth full of rapier teeth cracked open in Skagg's belly, and a disgusting, yellowish fluid dripped from the points of the upper fangs. Frank fired 4 shots that knocked Skagg down again, then fired the 2 remaining rounds into him as he lay on the balcony floor. While Frank reloaded with his last cartridges, Skagg rose again and approached. "Are you ready?" Are you ready to die, you chicken shit cop? Not really. I only have one more car payment to make, and for once, I'd sure like to know what it's like to really own one of the damn things. In the end, you'll bleed like all the others. Will I? You'll scream like all the others. If it's always the same, don't you get tired of it? Wouldn't you like me to bleed and scream differently? Just for some variety? Skag scuttled forward. Frank emptied the gun into him. Skag went down, got up, and spewed forth a noxious stream of shrill laughter. Frank threw aside the empty revolver. The eyes and mouth vanished from the shape-changer's chest and belly. In their place, he sprouted 4 small, segmented, crab-like arms with fingers that ended in pincers. Retreating along the metal grid balcony, past glass office doors that flared with reflected lightning, Frank said, "You know what your trouble is, Skag? You're too flamboyant. You might be a lot more frightening if you were more subtle. All these changes, this frenzied discarding of one form after another, it's just too dazzling. The mind has difficulty comprehending, so the result is more awesome than terrifying. Know what I mean?" If Skag understood, he either disagreed or did not care, for he caused curved, bony spikes to burst forth from his chest, and he said, "I'll pull you close and impale you, then suck the eyes out of your skull." To fulfill the second half of his threat, he rearranged his face yet again, creating a protruding tubular orifice where his mouth had been. Fine, sharp teeth rimmed the edge of it, and it made a disgustingly wet, vacuuming sound. "That's exactly what I mean by flamboyant," Frank said, as he backed up against the railing at the end of the balcony. Skag was only 10 feet away now. Regretting that the game was over, Frank released his body from the human pattern that he had imposed upon it. His bones dissolved. Fingernails, hair, internal organs, fat, muscle, and all other forms of tissue became as one, undifferentiated. His body was entirely amorphous. The darksome, jellied, throbbing mass flowed out of his suit through the bottoms of his sleeves. With a rustle, his clothes collapsed in a soft heap on the metal grid floor of the balcony. Beside his empty suit, Frank reassumed his human form, standing naked before his would-be assailant. That is the way to transform yourself without destroying your clothes in the process. Considering your impetuosity, I'm surprised you have any wardrobe left at all." Shocked, Skag abandoned his monstrous appearance and put on his human cloak. "You're one of my kind." "Nah," Frank said. "One of your species, but certainly not one of your demented kind. I live in peace with ordinary men, as most of our people have for thousands of years. You, on the other hand, are a repulsive degenerate, mad with your own power, driven by the insane need to dominate." "Live in peace with them?" Skag said scornfully. "But they're born to die. And we're immortal. They're weak. We're strong. They've no purpose but to provide us with pleasure of one kind or another, to titillate us with their death agonies." "On the contrary," Frank said, "they're valuable, because their lives are a continuing reminder to us that existence without self-control is only chaos. I spend nearly all of my time locked within this human form, and with but rare exception, I force myself to suffer human pain, and to endure both the anguish and joy of human existence. "Ah, you're the one who's mad?" Frank shook his head. "Through police work I serve humankind, and therefore my existence has meaning. They so terribly need us to help them along, you see." "Need us?" As a roar of thunder was followed by a downpour more vigorous than at any previous moment of the storm, Frank searched for the words that might evoke understanding, even in Skagg's diseased mind. "The human condition is unspeakably sad. Think of it. Their bodies are fragile. Their lives are brief, each like the sputtering decline of a short candle. Measured against the age of the earth itself, their deepest relationships with friends and family are of the most transitory nature, mere incandescent flashes of love and kindness that do nothing to light the great, endless, dark, flowing river of time, yet they seldom surrender to the cruelty of their condition, seldom lose faith in themselves. Their hopes are rarely fulfilled, but they go on, anyway, struggling against the darkness. Their determined striving in the face of their mortality is the very definition of courage, the essence of nobility." Skaggs stared at him in silence for a long moment, then let loose another peal of insane laughter. "They're prey, you fool! Toys for us to play with! Nothing more! What nonsense is this about our lives requiring purpose, struggle, self-control? Chaos isn't to be feared or disparaged. Chaos is to be embraced. Chaos, beautiful chaos, is the base condition of the universe, where the titanic forces of stars and galaxies clash without purpose or meaning. Chaos can't coexist with love," Frank said. "Love is a force for stability and order." "Then what need is there for love?" Skagg asked, and he spoke the final word of that sentence in a particularly scornful tone. Frank sighed. "Well, I have an appreciation of the need for love. I've been enlightened by my contact with the human species." "Enlightened? Corrupted is the better word." Nodding, Frank said, "Of course, you would see it that way. The sad thing is that for love, in the defense of love, I'll have to kill you." Skagg was darkly amused.
"Kill me?
What sort of joke is this? You can't kill me any more than I can kill you. We're both immortal, you and I." "You're young," Frank said. "Even by human standards, you're only a young man, and by our standards, you're an infant. I'd say I'm at least 300 years older than you."
"So?"
"So there are talents we acquire only with great age."
"What talents?"
"Tonight I've watched you flaunt your genetic plasticity. I've seen you assume many fantastic forms, but I haven't seen you achieve the ultimate in cellular control. Which is the complete breakdown into an amorphous mass that, in spite of utter shapelessness, remains a coherent being. The feat I performed when I shucked off my clothes. It requires iron control because it takes you to the brink of chaos, where you must retain your identity while on the trembling edge of dissolution. You haven't acquired that degree of control, for if total amorphousness had been in your power, you'd have tried to terrify me with an exhibition of it. But your shape-changing is so energetic that it's frenzied. You transform yourself at a whim, assuming whatever shape momentarily seizes your fancy, with a childish lack of discipline.
So what?
Skag remained unafraid, blissfully sure of himself, arrogant.
Your greater skill in no way changes the fact that I'm immortal. Invincible. For me, all wounds heal regardless of how bad they may be. Poisons flush from my system without effect. No degree of heat. No Arctic cold, no explosion less violent than a nuclear blast. No acid can shorten my life by so much as 1 second.
But you're a living creature with a metabolic system, Frank said. And by one means or another, by lungs in your human form, by other organs when in other forms, you must respire. You must have oxygen to maintain life. Skag stared at him, not comprehending the threat. In an instant, Frank surrendered human form, assumed a totally amorphous state, spread himself as if he were a giant manta ray in the depths of the sea, and flew forward, wrapping himself tightly around Skag. His flesh conformed to every fold and crease, every concavity and convexity of Skag's body. He enveloped his startled adversary, sheathing every millimeter of Skag, stoppering his nose and ears, coating every hair, denying him access to oxygen. Within that jellied cocoon, Skag sprouted claws and horns and bony, barbed spikes from various portions of his anatomy, attempting to gouge and tear through the suffocating tissue that bound him. But Frank's flesh couldn't be torn or punctured. Even as his cells parted before a razor claw, they flowed together and knitted instantly in the wake of that cutting edge. Skag formed 6 mouths at various places on his body. Some were filled with needle-tipped fangs, and some with double rows of shark's teeth, and all of them tore ravenously at his adversary's flesh. But Frank's amorphous tissue flowed into the orifices instead of retreating from them. This is my body. Taste of it. Clogging them to prevent biting and swallowing, coating the teeth and thus dulling the edges. Skag assumed a repulsive insectoid shape Frank conformed. Skag sprouted wings and sought escape in flight. Frank conformed, weighed him down, and denied him the freedom of the air. Outside, the night was ruled by the chaos of the storm. In the warehouse, where the aisles were neatly arranged, where the humidity and temperature of the air were controlled, order ruled everywhere, except in the person of Carl Skag. But Skag's chaos was now firmly contained within the impenetrable envelope of Frank Shaw. The inescapable embrace with which Frank enfolded Skag was not merely that of an executioner, but that of a brother and a priest. He was gently conveying Skag out of this life,
and he was doing so with some measure of the regret with which he watched ordinary men suffer and expire from accident and disease. Death was the unwelcome son of chaos in a universe woefully in need of order. For the next hour, with diminishing energy, Skagg writhed and thrashed and struggled. A man could not have endured for so long without oxygen, but Skagg was not a man. He was both more and less than human. Frank was patient. Hundreds of years of self-enforced adaptation to the limits of the human condition had taught him extreme patience. He held fast to Skagg a full half-hour after the last detectable sign of life ebbed from the mad creature, and Skagg was as encapsulated as an object dipped in preserving bronze, or eternally frozen in a cube of amber. Then Frank returned to human form. Carl Skagg's corpse was in human form as well, for that was the final metamorphosis that he had undergone in the last seconds of his agonizing suffocation. In death, he looked as pathetic and fragile as any man. When he had dressed, Frank carefully wrapped Skagg's body in a tarp that he found in a corner of the warehouse. This was one corpse that could not be permitted to fall into the hands of a pathologist, for the profound mysteries of its flesh would alert humankind to the existence of the secret race that lived among them. He carried the dead shape-changer outside, through the rainy night, to his Chevy. Gently he lowered Skagg into the car trunk and closed the lid. Before dawn, in the dark, scrub-covered hills along the perimeter of the Angeles National Forest, with the yellow-pink metropolitan glow of Los Angeles filling the lowlands south and west of him, Frank dug a deep hole and slipped Skagg's corpse into the ground. As he filled the grave, he wept. From that wild burial ground, he went directly home to his cozy 5-room bungalow. Murphy, his Irish setter, was at the door to greet him with much sniffling and tail-wagging. Seuss, his cat, held back at first with typical feline aloofness, but at last the Siamese rushed to him as well, purring noisily and wanting to be stroked. Though the night had been filled with strenuous activity, Frank did not go to bed, for he never required sleep. Instead, he got out of his wet clothes, put on pajamas and a robe, made a large bowl of popcorn, opened a beer, and settled down on the sofa with Seuss and Murphy to watch an old Frank Capra movie that he had seen at least 20 times before, but that he never failed to enjoy. Jimmy Stewart and Donna Reed in It's a Wonderful Life. All of Frank Shaw's friends said that he had a hard shell, but that was only part of what they said. They also said that inside his hard shell beat a heart as soft as any.
Trapped. 1. On the night that it happened, a blizzard swept the entire Northeast. Creatures that preferred to venture out only after sunset were, therefore, doubly cloaked by darkness and the storm. Snow began to fall at twilight as Meg Lassiter drove home from the doctor's office with Tommy. Powdery flakes sifted out of an iron-gray sky, and at first fell straight down through the cold, still air. By the time she had covered 8 miles, a hard wind had blasted in from the southwest and harried the snow at a slant through the headlights of the Jeep station wagon. Behind her, sitting sideways on the rear seat, To accommodate his cast-encumbered leg, Tommy sighed. I'm going to miss a lot of sledding, skiing, ice skating too. It's early in the season, Meg said. You ought to heal up in time to have some fun before spring. Yeah, well, maybe. He had broken his leg 2 weeks ago, and during the follow-up visit to Dr. Jacqueline a short while ago, they had learned that he'd be in a cast another 6 weeks. The fracture was splintered. Minor, but complicating comminution. Impacted as well, and it would knit more slowly than a simple break. But Mom, there's only so many winters in a life. I hate to waste one. Meg smiled and glanced at the rearview mirror, in which she could see him. You're only 10 years old, honey. In your case, the winters ahead are countless, or darn close to it. No way, Mom. Soon it'll be college, which will mean a lot more studying, not so much time to have fun. That's 8 years away. You always say time goes faster the older you get, and after college I'll have a job and then a family to support. Trust me, Buckaroo, life doesn't speed up till you're 30. Though he was as fun-loving as any 10-year-old, he was also occasionally a strangely serious boy. He'd been that way even as a toddler, but he had become increasingly solemn after his father's death 2 years ago. Meg braked for the last stoplight at the north end of town, still 7 miles from their farm. She switched on the wipers, which swept the fine, dry snow from the windshield. How old are you, Mom? 35. Wow, really? You make it sound as if I'm ancient. Did they have cars when you were 10? His laugh was musical. Meg loved the sound of his laughter, perhaps because she had heard so little of it during the past 2 years. On the right-hand corner, 2 cars and a pickup were filling up at the Shell station pumps. A 6-foot pine tree was angled across the bed of the truck. Christmas was only 8 days away. On the left-hand corner was Heddenbeck's Tavern, standing before a backdrop of 100-foot spruces. In the burnt-out gray twilight, the falling snow was like cascading ashes descending from an unseen celestial blaze, though in the amber light of the roadhouse windows, the flakes resembled not ashes, but gold dust. Come to think of it, Tommy said from the rear seat, how could there have been cars when you were 10? I mean, gee, they didn't invent the wheel till you were 11. Tonight for dinner, worm cakes and beetle soup. You're the meanest mother in the world. She glanced at the mirror again and saw that in spite of his bantering tone, the boy was not smiling any longer. He was staring grimly at the tavern. Slightly more than 2 years ago, a drunk named Deke Slater had left Heddenbeck's Tavern at the same time that Jim Lassiter